Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Faerie Conclave. I am your host, Alec. My pronouns are he, him. This is episode number 70, and I have a very special guest on for this episode. It's Dana Roach. Dana, how are you doing today?
I am doing great, Alec. Thanks a lot for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yes, I am super excited to have you on. I'm a big fan of the EDHREC podcast and also CMDR Central. And I also read all of your articles on all of the various article sites that you write for. So I'm very honored and excited to have you on as a guest. So thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. Those are very nice things to say. I appreciate that.
Yeah. While we're on the topic, I wanted to say that your article series on EDHREC, I think it's called Superior Numbers. Is that the article series title? Yep. Perfect. I'm a huge fan of that one just because one of my having an engineering background, the intersection between using EDHREC data to make commander decks and kind of like the conclusions you can draw there is super interesting to me. So that's an especially interesting article series. So thank you for writing it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's the same for me too. Like that's what I find. That's one of the things, at least, about the game I find fun is those little tiny in the margins kind of like improvements to decks, and just the minutia of it is something that I find fascinating. So I'm in the same boat. Like I write about it because I find it interesting.
Yeah, I love it. That's the way to do it, and I agree. I think it's always super exciting to me when I make a couple little swaps in the deck that are just so it'll only matter in 0.1% of games, but I'm right. Yes, this card is slightly more efficient and it'll be so
exactly
perfect. Yeah. Yeah, and so we have you on today to do a commander deck interview, but before we kind of dive into the interview, let's do our community spotlight for the episode. So today's episode, I am going to shout out the CMDR Central podcast, which you are one of the hosts of, as well as Max and Chris. And yeah, it's a big podcast for me. I love it. And whenever you have a commander that you're discussing or something related to a commander that I have built or that I'm kind of brewing, I always I'm instantly playing that episode. I'm like, okay, I need to get some opinions in here on this commander. So if I could throw it over to you, could you give us some more background on that podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually just recorded an episode this morning. We had a 2-week hiatus, which I don't know if we've ever actually missed a week over the course of the 4 years, but we had a 2-week hiatus because Chris was dealing with a few things medically, and he's fine, but he was just out. He couldn't get on and record, so it was just Max and I, and then Max had something. Yeah. So I'm like, well, I really wasn't gonna just record me ranting into a microphone or something. So I'm like, we wound up having basically a 2-week window where we had no shows, but everyone was back this morning. We were all on the same page, so we recorded one that will air next Monday. So we are Sweet. Back in as close as we get as full form, at least.
I'm looking forward to it. I know that feeling. I'm always planning out the next episode, but for sure there are a couple weeks sometimes where I just can't make it work, or something pops up and I'm just like, well, my guest couldn't make it, and so I'm not the biggest fan of talking to myself and recording it, so we'll just skip this week.
Yeah, sometimes life just happens and you gotta roll with it. Yep,
it's true.
But that's my original show, and it's what first kind of got me into content creation. And it was basically because a couple of my friends, Chris and Max included, we would play Commander on Tuesday night locally in our shop, and the shop happened to be a block from my office where I worked back when we used to actually go to the office.
Right.
And there was a little bar that had pretty good pizza that was basically in between my office and the shop. So we would just go there after work. I would meet the guys there, and we would, have a couple pieces of pizza and a beer, and then, go play Commander half an hour, 45 minutes later or something at the shop.
Nice.
So we'd get our dinner and go play. And of course, the whole time that we were there having beer and pizza, we'd talk about Commander, because we're going to go play Commander in half an hour anyway. We might as well, let's talk about, hey, what stuff happened this week? Did you see the new previews, whatever, what's going on? And someone's jokingly, someone said, this is basically a podcast. You guys should just record this. so we did. Because at the time, Command Zone was a thing. Commander's Brew was going, and I think there was a show Commanderin that Phil DeLuca was doing. I think Shivam was on it originally for a little bit too at one point in time. But like aside from that, there really wasn't much in the way of Commander content out there.
Yeah.
So like literally our joke was, well, there's 3 other Commander podcasts, so we've got a pretty good chance of being the 4th best one. So we hey, why not? And there were a couple other shows that roughly started around the same time. People must have had the same idea because that's about when Commander Cookout fired up. The guys up in Saskatoon, and I think Brothers War, which is now Commander Social, started up at the same time. I think Legendary Creature kicked off. So a bunch of people had the same idea. And of course, now there's a lot of Commander content. You don't have a problem finding it at all. But yeah, that was our idea, was just let's do this thing for fun. And once I started doing it, I just kind of found I enjoyed it. So then I started writing articles for EDHREC. And then EDHREC wanted to do a show, and I volunteered to try out for that. And then now I'm doing that. And it's become a huge part of my life for something that was just kind of a lark originally.
I love it. And you are slowly absorbing more and more podcasts to host over time.
Right, yeah, right. Let's see how much content I can show up on over the course of the average week.
Yeah. That's great. That's a very similar kind of origin story to me. It was literally just, playing Commander, hanging out, talking about Commander, which is always just nonstop conversation about whatever is going on at the time. And yeah, my partner was kind of playing Animal Crossing and like chimed in and was like, you should just like record this and make it into a podcast or something. And yeah, a couple of us looked at each other and we were like, oh, that's a thing people do. Like, we could do that.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, the barrier to entry is relatively low for a podcast. I mean, there's work, but like, you can just kind of start doing it, and you can just do it for fun. Like, it doesn't have to be a thing that makes you money or makes you famous. Just enjoy doing it. I think that's one of the things that's been super cool about the rise of podcasting as a medium, particularly in Commander, I guess. There's a ton of shows out there. There's a lot of people that are just having fun and making their content. I used to, when I would walk into work, would listen to the couple of Commander shows, and I would then listen to other things. If I wanted to, now I could listen to 50 hours of Commander content a week.
Yeah.
And I don't, because that would be insane. But like, there's so many options. That is cool. That's really, like, if there's something you're looking for, you can find something. There's a gazillion people doing really interesting content out there and enjoying themselves, and that's just so good for the format, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's true. I have this spreadsheet where I keep track of all of the community spotlights we've done, and whenever I find a new creator that I like, I'll add them to the list, and I've probably got like 40 people on the list like to hit, just because I'm always checking out new Commander content. There's so much out there. I love looking for it. And you're right, it's kind of funny. I used to deplete all of my Magic related podcasts content first when I was commuting. And now I don't really commute, so I consume way less of that. It's mostly kind of like hanging out and listening while I'm doing dishes or something. But still my favorite place to start when I'm picking a podcast.
I totally feel you. Exactly. I'm in the same boat.
It's good. Okay, so let's dive into the deck interview, the reason why I asked you to come on the show. So, and just to kind of give a little background, the reason why I love doing these deck interviews so much is because you get a lot of other people's personality in their deck, and it's just super fun and invigorating for me to talk to people about their decks that they built, because if you know Commander players, you know that they kind of put their heart and soul into their brewing process. And I think it's really fun to talk about. So I'll kick things off with the first question for you, which is, could you introduce us to your Commander and what inspired you to build this deck in the first place?
Sure. So my Commander is Vela the Night-Clad. She's a Dimir Commander, 6 mana, 4 and a blue and a black. For a human wizard, she has Intimidate and says other creatures you control have Intimidate. And whenever Vela the Night-Clad or another creature you control leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. So I believe originally she was actually a ninja commander. I'm not sure why she isn't a ninja herself. But that was a way for your ninjas to have a good chance to poke through unblocked. Then you could do ninja things, ninjutsu things, and also deal damage while the creatures were, coming off the battlefield. So I think it was in Plane Chase, I want to say 2011, but I'm not positive. And what inspired me to build it, this was actually one of the early cards I saw when I first got into Commander, around Return to Ravnica, when I came back to the game, and very quickly, discovered Commander as a format, so I wanted to brew a deck. She was one of the first cards I saw, and it was because of the art. I thought the art just looked super cool. So I started trying to think of what I could do with the deck. And the first attempt I made way back in the day was I actually tried to build an Infect deck. Because I'm like, okay, Vela gives stuff Intimidate, so that will allow my creatures to poke through.
Yeah.
Mostly unblocked.
It makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, so what I didn't really account for in all of that was, number one, everyone hates Infect. So you get targeted in a way that maybe the deck couldn't handle. And so many of the particularly blue Infect creatures, with the black ones necessarily aren't great either. The really good ones are in green. So I had a pretty weak suite of Infect creatures. And of course, we haven't really got anything since then either. So the deck probably wouldn't have had much chance to grow. So I did try that, though, for a few months, and it just didn't work, so I set it aside. But I had the card, the Commander there, and it's one of those things that I just kept pulling out. I didn't have a Dimir deck. I wanted a Dimir deck. I'm like, I'm eventually going to come up with something. At one point, I was like, do I want to try Eldrazi? Because, they're technically colorless. They would be unblockable. What I wound up settling on was, originally at least, I thought I would just build kind of an artifact creature deck. I think Scuttling Doom Engine had been in Standard not too long prior to that. And I'm like, Scuttling Doom Engine, stuff like that. Well, I can put those will go through unblockable if I get some kind of efficiently costed beater creatures that are colorless. I can play Vela, and that was my only plan then. So I'll play Vela, I can swing through with these Scuttling Doom Engine style creatures, hit people in the face, and that'll be the deck. So that was the core of this current version. Once the Infect one fell on its face, a couple of years later, I tried again using kind of basically beater artifact creatures.
I like it, and I was gonna say one of the things that when I first started kind of looking at commanders, and when I learned about Commander and realized that legendary creatures kind of are more exciting than I had thought previously. I remember seeing Vela the Night-Clad and just being stunned by the art also, and being thinking I had to try to build a Commander deck around it.
It's so odd and kind of ethereal, and it's mysterious and pretty, and it's a great little piece of art. So yeah, that is 100% what brought me to that card, and is why I kept coming back to it and trying to figure out what my hook was going to be to make it work.
I love it. Yeah, it's kind of interesting too because it's a 6-mana creature, which is pretty huge for a 4/4 Intimidate. Right. And then the art is kind of this, I don't know, it's light and flowy, and doesn't really give the presence of this 6-mana 4/4 creature. And there's something about
exactly.
that I really like it. It's there's a lot of power here that maybe you wouldn't expect. Based on the art, which I love. So. Yeah, that's interesting. I totally didn't realize that she was kind of designed around ninjas, which you wouldn't really be able to tell, but I guess it kind of makes sense.
Yeah, looking at the card, you wouldn't guess that at all, for sure.
Yeah.
So after I kind of got the beater deck version of this in play and played it and was able to win a couple games, I'm like, so this is actually playable. It's a deck I can use. So then I started trying to figure out, okay, well, what can I do with it beyond just punching someone with a Scuttling Doom Engine? And I'm like, well, there's a couple of different Tezzerets in the color, so maybe I'll, make some kind of a Tezzeret theme. So I threw a handful of Tezzerets in the deck, and just through happenstance, there's a couple of those Tezzerets that deal damage based on the amount of artifacts you control.
Yeah.
And I already had a bunch of artifact creatures. I'm like, oh, that's some accidental kind of synergy there. Then I started, okay, well, what things can I put in the deck that maybe make artifact tokens or something? Hangerback Walker had been released shortly before that, so I put a Hangerback Walker in there and a few things like that. And then that winds up accidentally working with Vela, because Vela has a trigger when a creature leaves the battlefield. Okay, so if I'm going to make a bunch of tokens, I can use them with the Tezzeret abilities to, deal damage to someone based on the amount of artifacts I control. Or I can, play an Ashnod's Ultra and sacrifice 7 or 8 or 10 things and deal that much damage to people as well. So it just wound up being several pieces of accidental synergy that shaped the deck to where it's at today, where I just kept finding things that just kind of worked with one another without that being my intention. It wasn't like I had the idea and put the thing into a deck. It was I put a thing into a deck and then realized it worked after the fact.
That is so much fun. That's such a classic commander moment where you kind of figure out this synergy just by testing out different things, and it works really well. And I really like it for this card specifically because Vela doesn't say anything about artifacts on it or colorless things. It doesn't imply that this is going to be an artifact deck just looking at the commander. But yeah, then when you think about it, it's Intimidate makes it so all of my colorless stuff is really hard to block, which is a kind of a win condition path there. And then also with all these tokens leaving the battlefield, that's another win condition there. So Vela kind of has multiple options that work really well with artifacts and artifact tokens. So it totally makes sense.
It worked out to be a deck that makes me look more clever than I actually am because of how it works. So yes, no, that was not all just me thinking things through that deeply and finding a deck that works well. It's just me stumbling across synergies for the most part.
Sometimes that's what you have to do, though. When
I will take it for sure.
When the new commanders get spoiled, I'm not, considering every possible strategy with each commander. Sometimes you just kind of have to stumble your way through until you find something cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you for talking about some of the history and background. Do you have any other specific changes the deck has gone through since you first built it that you want to talk about or shout out?
Just been a lot of little things. Magic has just ramped up the amount of cards it releases per year. So there's just that many more opportunities for new things to show up in the list that bump something else out. That, I mentioned Scuttling Doom Engine multiple times. That's not in the deck anymore because, gotcha. Things like Traxos, Scourge of Krug has replaced it. Traxos, it's a 7/7. So there's some of the beaters that are in my deck have been altered over the years. And, artifacts, there's just always new toys that you get. So this is the kind of deck where there are some decks, I mentioned the Infect version of this. Had I kept that deck, I probably wouldn't have had that many changes that showed up in it because said we don't get Infect creatures. But because we just always get new artifact stuff, I am just always getting, or at least very frequently getting brand new toys. I don't know if I'm going to make any changes for New Capenna, I don't think, which is actually kind of odd. But there was a ton of stuff in Kamigawa that worked in this deck. So that's one thing that's been a lot of fun about it is there's just always different things I can change and shake up and tweaks I can make to make it play a little more like what I want it to play like.
Nice. Yeah, I think decks like that you, every set might offer a little something for you to test out are really fun for me because then I'm always kind of interested in playing them so I can test out those 1 or 2 new cards that I picked up in the last set. So yeah.
And it's so frustrating when you don't draw them. You're like, come on, I just want to draw one of those new things and try it out.
I've had a couple of times where I put a new card in, a full year goes by and I never draw it.
Exactly.
And then I go to check out another new card and I'm like, well, I didn't even draw this card. I don't know if it's good. I'll just switch it with this one. I never even got the chance.
I have absolutely done that before, for sure. I've been there.
Oh, man. Yeah, we'll get into the specific cards a little bit later, but one thing that I think is cool about Vela is being a 6 CMC legend is kind of these days pretty high. You kind of have to be pretty conscious of that, I think, when you're building a deck with a 6 CMC commander. So one inclusion that I'm really happy to see is Stinging Study, which pays you off so nicely for having an expensive commander. And that's one thing that I would like to see more of in the future is having kind of payoffs for playing those very expensive commanders.
Totally agree. It's a great card. I've got it in multiple decks, although I happen to have multiple black decks that have expensive commanders. It just has worked out that way. So, I have it more than one deck. A great card. And yeah, it is, 6 is a tough number to get to. It works out in this deck. It's not that huge of a problem because of the way she works. I don't want to drop her until I'm going to make a move, whether it's attacking with a bunch of stuff or whether it's having a bunch of tokens that I'm going to sacrifice, whatever it winds up being. So I can wait to drop her until I'm at the point in the game where it really matters. It's not one of those commanders where it's expensive and the deck doesn't do anything until I can get it into play. The deck can do its thing if she's offline, and then I can drop her when I'm at that point when I most need her. So it really works out nicely in that regard. She's very much an option in this deck, or a finisher in a lot of ways, as opposed to a cog that the deck needs to have working in order to do its thing.
Gotcha. Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think probably most commander decks want to kind of get their commander out as fast as possible, and then the engine is built around that. I know a similar deck that I have been playing a lot recently is Eloise, which is a 5-mana Dimir commander, and a couple of problems I've had with that deck are it doesn't do too much until I get Eloise out to start cranking out the Surveil and Clue tokens and stuff. So yeah, it's really cool to kind of have a commander that sits there until your other engines, which artifacts have plenty of, are already kind of set up and going.
Well, and that's one of the things I like with the deck quite a bit, is there are a lot of paths to victory, so it feels like the deck does play differently every time. Sometimes it is I'm just beating people in the face because I have a Arcbound Crusher out that's got 14 counters on it, and a Wormcoil Engine in play as well, and I can just hit somebody so hard they are out of life. And sometimes I can do things with a Tezzeret, and sometimes I have a Karn Silver Golem out, or I have a couple different ways to turn artifacts into creatures. So Rise and Shine would be one of those. Yeah. So sometimes I can turn a bunch of artifacts into creatures and then swing in with Vela for lethal damage, or I can turn those artifacts into creatures and sacrifice a bunch of them to do the Vela 1 damage per leave the battlefield trigger. So there's just the deck has a lot of different ways to get to that same point, and it always feels like it plays differently, which makes it a lot of fun, and why it's one of my favorite decks. It's a new experience every time, and I'm always finding different ways to assemble the pieces that get me to the same end point.
I think that's really important to have kind of variety built into your deck. It helps a lot when new cards come out, because you're like, well, this, I have a lot of various kind of things going on here, so let's just kind of test out this new thing and see if it works with the old stuff. And it always kind of keeps things feeling fresh, which I think is important to keep in mind.
Exactly.
So the next question I've got for you is, what is your favorite thing about playing this deck? What's just like the thing you like the most?
The interactions, I think, between different pieces. A lot of the cards interact with one another in different ways depending on what I'm doing and in what point in the game I'm at. I mentioned Rise and Shine. It's a card that lets all your artifact creatures become artifact creatures, and you put +1 counters on them. I have a bunch of artifact lands in this deck, and I also have ways to sometimes make artifact land tokens. So being able to I have been in a position before where I've straight up killed people with unblockable artifact lands. It's ridiculous. That's a ridiculous way to win a game, but it's super fun. It's memorable. That I remember, I've definitely in the past killed people with a Crater Hoof Behemoth, but I can't remember any of those. And It's happened to me. I've been killed by a ton of Crater Hoof Behemoths before, but none of them stand out in my brain. Whereas I remember the time that I killed people with animated artifact lands. That makes for an interesting story. And the deck tends to play that way. When I win the game, it's because something interesting happened that made me feel like my brewing and understanding my deck got me to that position. That feels good to me. The fact that I felt like my own initiative is what got me there. I was kind of in control.
I like it. Yeah, moments like that are just so fun because you feel so cool and clever when things finally pay off.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that. Yeah, it's always a good time to say things like, all right, I'm going to send 6 treasure tokens at you my Fellwar Stone and my Dimir Signet at you. It's like, what is even going on here?
Yep, exactly.
Nice. I like it. I have a similar Rise and Shine strategy in my Eloise deck, so I'm seeing some similarities.
Makes sense there with a bunch of clue tokens for sure.
Yeah, and it's like, who doesn't want to just attack with an army of clues or whatever little artifact lands and things laying around? Definitely a memorable thing to do, and yeah, I'm a big fan. So we've gone through a lot about ways this deck wins. Do you have any other kind of goals for the deck or anything that maybe you keep in mind while you're playing?
In terms of goals, I guess I'll take a step back and talk about when I brewed it up, kind of my goal. This was the first deck I think that I built. I was very consciously trying to do a kind of archetype, but do an archetype in colors that didn't normally do that archetype. Because I think the deck I had built right before this, when I had built a Mina and Den landfall deck right after Mina and Den came out. And I had tried the red-green Omnath, and I didn't love it. And then the next set was Mina and Den. I'm like, oh, that's the landfall commander I was looking for. So I just converted that Omnath deck into Mina and Den. But every red-green landfall deck kind of looks similar to each other to a degree.
Yeah.
And that's kind of unavoidable. Even if you're playing, as far as landfall commanders, Mina and Den don't see a ton of play. So I have one that's maybe less frequently played than another. But the deck still kind of looks similar to other landfall decks. So I think that there was a conscious decision here where I wanted something that was doing artifact creature stuff. That was something I liked as an idea. And I was always looking for a deck for Vela anyway. So those two things came together. Like I could build an artifact creature deck here. I could use this commander that I've always wanted to use because I think it's just a great looking piece of art. I can also do it in color combinations where people really aren't doing that. That's going to make the deck, again, feel kind of unique to me, which I really enjoy. I like having it feel like it was my own creation, and it's kind of unique and not like the deck at the next table. This was really the first one where that was my goal, to brew something in a color pair that didn't necessarily lean into doing what those colors or what the archetype is doing.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's a really cool thing to look out for. And back then, I don't even think we had a lot of red-blue commanders for artifacts. I know that was kind of a requested
not
thing.
Even.
And now we have a ton of options for that, but I still don't think we have a lot of blue-black options for artifact commanders. So, yeah.
There's probably some stuff you could do with partners now, I would bet. But yeah, It's still not something you really necessarily see in those colors, which is something I liked. And then since moving forward, I've kind of made it a point to do that with decks. I do have an equipment kind of Voltron deck, but I built it Azorius versus doing the usual kind of Boros version of that. So that's something I've really very much leaned into. When I built an Izzet deck, I built an Izzet Combat Tricks deck that was based on Smashing Phase, because that's not an Izzet thing that you usually see. So I've been ever since then. That's something I've been made an attempt to do. But this was really kind of the proof of concept where I first made a concerted attempt to do that, and I was able to do it to the point where I at least enjoyed it and was happy with the end result.
I like that. I think that changing up what colors you're using and in making them do things that aren't maybe their normal strategy is a really fun way to kind of challenge yourself for deck building.
Sure.
Yeah, I know there's kind of the first time I thought about building decks that way. There's a cube out there that I'll have to look it up. I can't remember who built it, but a pretty well-known cube that's color twisted or color shifted or something, where all of the strategies and archetypes are things that those color combinations don't normally do. And I think about that a lot. I like building decks that way because it's more unique, and you're just here's my Azorius deck, and it's going to attack with giant creatures, and that's not something you see very often.
Yep, exactly.
It's cool. There's a new Azorius commander that is like a Grumgully. It puts +1/+1 counters on things, and that's honestly one of the more interesting commanders to me because I've never seen that, even though we've seen that in green-red a million times, not in white-blue. So I'm totally a fan of things like that too. Okay, so next question I've got for you is, what are some of this deck's weaknesses, and is there anything that you kind of do when you're playing to potentially mitigate those weaknesses?
So the main weakness is I'm going to fold hard to particularly an artifact sweeper, whether it's like a Bane of Progress or a Merciless Eviction or something. Because aside from, I think there's 3 enchantments and there's 4 planeswalkers. Aside from those enchantments and those planeswalkers, every other permanent is an artifact. I guess not all of my lands are, but like there's 20 artifacts, there's 20 artifact creatures, there's I think 5 artifact lands in here. So any kind of an artifact sweeper really hits me hard. And to make that worse, you can maybe compensate for that in some decks with counter spells. I don't have any counter spells in this deck.
Gotcha.
And it's not entirely because I'm some benevolent person who doesn't want to run counter spells. I just didn't have room. Like at one point in time, I had a couple in the deck, but I kept feeling like I needed more, whatever. I needed more ramp. I needed more draw, and I had to cut something. And the deck actually didn't really kind of work right until I pulled like the last 3 counter spells out and just put in the 3 spells I wanted. That's when everything finally clicked. So it's a blue deck that probably could really use a few counter spells to stop those sweepers. That doesn't happen. I have no counter spells in this deck because there's so many different things I'm trying to do where I want to have cards that do those things. Something had to go, and it wound up being counter magic.
That makes a lot of sense.
I mean, it makes as much sense. I mean, it part of it's me being obstinate. I mean, absolutely, I could cut some fun things out and find counter magic, but I would rather lose a couple of games to sweepers and have the deck just play the way I want it to play the rest of the time than make those changes and run for the 4 or 5 counter spells I would probably need to be able to protect myself against those artifact sweepers.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a kind of a tension that I've run into building artifact decks in the past, as well as, or kind of any deck that cares about a certain type of card for its effects. You just need to pack in as many as possible, and looking at those instants and just thinking they could be artifacts or something that
exactly
artifacts.
Yep.
Yeah, I totally I can imagine the struggle to like take those out, but. I totally know what you mean. And the other thing I was going to say that I've noticed is a lot of sweepers that maybe normally would just be creatures just kind of throw on and also hits artifacts or enchantments just as a bonus. So it seems like, there's like Farewell and other recent board wipes that just...
Austere Command always hits me hard, and Cleansing Nova. Yeah, there's plenty.
Yep. Yeah, I've had some friends who say I'm not trying to I'm not too worried about your artifacts. I just need to cast this to hit creatures, but I'm gonna hit the artifacts too. I'm like, come on.
Yep.
Oh man. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So do you have any cards in this deck that you would like to shout out that fill kind of generic roles? Things like card draw, mana ramp, and removal that might be more unique to this deck?
Prototype Portal is probably one of my favorite ramp spells in this deck. It's a 4 mana artifact that has imprint on it. So on ETBs, you can exile an artifact card from your hand, and then for X, you can tap it and put a token onto the battlefield. That's a copy of that artifact, and X is the mana cost of that card. So, were I to imprint a Wormcoil Engine on it, for example, I could spend 6 and tap it and make a Wormcoil Engine token. 99% of the time when I use this, has an artifact land underneath it. Ideally a Darksteel Citadel, so they're indestructible. But I've at this point we've even gotten things like Power Depot. That's an artifact land. That's just a land that has modular 1. We had the ones that were way back in the day that are banned in Modern, like Vault of Whispers, and City of the Synods. We have those ones as well. But so the fact that we've actually gotten a couple in the last few years has helped make that card that much better. Just put an artifact line underneath that, and then I can tap it for 0. So basically, it's a way to, for no mana, once I get it out, I can make a land token every turn.
Wow.
And that winds up synergizing with stuff like the Rise and Shine to make all those artifacts into artifact creatures and attack with them. So. It's actually a quite effective little ramp tool, and I've once in a while I've happened to have a Soul Ring in hand when I drew it or something, put a Soul Ring underneath it. That feels pretty good too.
Yeah. Your Sol Rings
there's a
pay
Mox
for your-
Opal. Yeah, exactly. There's a Mox Opal in the deck just because there's a ton of artifacts. I'm like, oh, I can run a Mox Opal. That doesn't, I don't feel too bad about that. At least one occasion I've thrown a Mox Opal underneath it, and that feels perfectly fine too. So, yeah, there's probably 10 cards in here that I can use it for 0 or 1 mana to activate and be pretty happy with the end result. So that's definitely a sleeper card that both is very, very effective. And whenever I do it, there's almost always someone in the pod who's like, wait, what are you doing? You're making artifact land tokens? Which is always fun too. Like, that's always a good reaction. I'm pretty happy that when people are confused about some dumb thing I'm doing in a deck, that's kind of a win itself. So that's one that probably stands out for me as a card that kind of fills an oddball role, is definitely that Prototype Portal.
That's a really cool one. I will be 100% honest here. I have played this card quite a few times. I even played the pre-con that it came in 2018 when that came out. And I had never thought about using it to copy your lands. Maybe it was just the X cost. It just made me want to put like the biggest thing possible under it, which it really isn't that efficient. Like you still have to pay for it each time. So it's like cool to get a big thing each turn, but it's still pretty slow. So yeah, that's a really clever little ramp spell in essentially like colorless, like no green basically. You can still ramp.
Right. The other one that I do always like, there's a couple of tutors in this deck still, and Mystic Forge is kind of the Phyrexian Arena of the deck. If I want a permanent and play, it's going to draw me cards. It's an artifact that lets me look at the top card of my library, and I can cast a card off the top if it's an artifact card, or a colorless non-land card, which is in this deck almost always going to be an artifact. In this deck, because there's just so many artifacts, there's very frequently something on top I can get, so it very often winds up being an extra card per turn. But I also get those weird situations where, like, I have something in play like Joyra's Familiar that reduces the cost of artifacts. There's a couple other reducers in here as well that reduce the cost. So there's been situations where, like, I've had that out and I've had 1 or 2 cost reducers and I'm like, okay, what's in the top? Oh, there's a Thought Vessel. I'm just going to play that for free. What's the next card? Oh, there's a Spawning Pit. I'm just going to play that for free. What's the next card? Hey, it's a Mind Stone. I'm going to play that. What's the next card? It's a land. Well, I'm going to tap the Forge and exile the top card and see what's next. Hey, what's an artifact again? And it costs 3 mana, so I'm going to pay 1 and play that. And, like, there's been those times when I've chained 7 or 8 cards off in a single turn, and that feels fantastic. That's the other one that really jumps out at me. If I'm going to tutor up an artifact, it's almost always Mystic Forge, just because it's so much value in this deck.
Yeah, that seems pretty absurd in this deck, and it's I can definitely see how it takes that card plus very little else to kind of just get that engine rolling, and it'd be hard to stop after that. I just noticed one of my favorites cards is in here, and this is probably the best deck I've ever seen this card in. Liquimetal Torque, because all your creatures are artifacts already, but not your commander. But maybe you want your commander to be an artifact. So there it is.
It sometimes does matter for things like, even for if I'm doing Tezzeret damage, the artifact count is sometimes useful. Able to like squeak one more damage out, and then the thing that I've turned into an artifact I can sacrifice to Clan Ironworks or something. And get another trigger off it, in addition to just the utility of turning an opponent's thing to an artifact and being able to blow it up. I'm a big fan of Liquimetal Torque in general, but yeah, it's very good here.
I love to see that card. I guess, and you could turn a Tezzeret into an artifact with that, right? Because it's non-land permanent. Tezzeret, hey, you're an artifact now too. Okay, so this is probably my favorite question of all time to ask people, and that is, do you have any pet cards that you just can't resist playing in this deck?
I think to a degree that the Tezzerets I'm running kind of qualify for that. I didn't really know much about Tezzeret as a character, other than when I built the deck, I'm like, well, I have a Dimir deck doing artifact stuff. I guess I can put a Tezzeret in here because he does artifact stuff. So I think I put Agent of Bolus in here first, and then I think I put Tezzeret the Seeker in as well. I'm like, oh, these work pretty good. And I'm like, well, maybe I'll just kind of have a weird Tezzeret sub-theme. So that's one of the rules of the deck, is the only planeswalkers I allow myself to run are Tezzerets. And there's no real reason for it other than I just thought he was kind of cool looking, right? And, and he's the cards have all been effective. So Tezzeret Master of the Bridge, when that was released a few years back, I'm like, oh, perfect. That still does artifact stuff. It's Tezzeret, I'll put in the deck. And wound up being a crazy powerhouse.
Yeah.
It's a good card, but in this deck, it's phenomenal. So that's one, like that card will never leave this deck. And at this point, I probably could find better things than the couple of other Tezzerets I have in here. But I don't want to. I just like the fact that like sometimes I happen to have 2 or 3 Tezzerets in play, and that's just kind of a fun, weird thing that's part of this deck, and it's part of the identity, and they're just always going to be there. So like those are definitely ones that I think are just always going to stay, regardless of the fact that something better might come along at some point.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's really cool. Well, for one thing, the Tezzeret Master of the Bridge, I can't believe that the X damage, where X is the number of artifacts you control, is a plus ability. That's just like absurd.
And it's to each opponent. It's a plus, and it's to each opponent. That's insane.
Then you gain life. Like it just does everything you could possibly want.
Honestly, the biggest problem I have with it is I play it, and I'm like, do I want to immediately plus it, give it, or do I want to take advantage of the fact that my creatures' spells now have affinity for artifacts, and I could play these 3 creatures from my hand for free, and then plus Tezzeret, but I've given up priority so someone could remove them in response. Do I be greedy or not? That winds up being the biggest problem.
Ooh,
I almost always go for greed. I'm always like, let's see what happens. I'm going to play a couple creatures and then plus 2 it.
It would be hard to resist, for sure. I love that. I think I have a deck that I've been playing, and the commander has switched a few times. Right now I'm testing out Satoru for this, but it's basically a demons and Liliana kind of theme. So it plays a couple of the good Lilianas like Dreadhorde General, but then also a couple of the not so good Lilianas, but I just think they're neat, so it feels right to play them with the demons, so they'll always be there.
And I guess one thing, I can't believe I have not noted this about the deck so far, but I guess this is as good time as I need to mention it. This deck is actually fully altered as well.
Oh.
And that's part of the reason I don't have any Neon Dynasty cards in the list yet, because I have not got them back from my friend who's altering them.
Oh, nice.
But it was a thing. Ryan Penniff, who's on the Commander Cookout podcast.
Yes.
He also does a show called Commander Ad Populum. Ryan does alters. Basically, it's a full-time job in addition to podcasting, and does fantastic work. And probably 5 years ago or so, when he first started doing alters, one of the first ones he did was a Vela the Night-Clad card.
Ooh.
Like, I'm just going to get that because the price was right, because no one was bidding on it, because no one wanted Vela. Like, the price is right, I'll get that from Ryan, I'll put it in the deck just to have the commander altered. And then a couple weeks later, I saw him. He had altered some revised basic lands. And he basically had blown the borders out on those as well, and did like this full land with no text box. It looked really cool. I'm like, I had just like bought a collection with a bunch of revised basics in it as well that were in new mint shape. So I'm like, Ryan, I'll just mail you these basics and let me know what you want to alter them. So he altered those lands because I liked the ones he had done. And then my friend Max in Commander Central wound up buying an altar from Ryan for me for Christmas. Well, now at this point, the commander's altered, and a dozen basics are altered, and Max bought me whatever card he bought me. So then I started sniping ones I needed from Ryan's auction here or there, and then eventually I just emailed him like, hey Ryan, if I just start sending you cards in batches of 10, let me know how much. So we made a deal that I spent probably 5 years getting 10 or 12 cards a year, paying him to alter for me. And we just finished the deck last summer. I think I got the last 4 or 5 cards done. So at this point, it's a fully altered deck that Ryan Penniff has done the whole thing. Every card in it has been altered by him.
That's incredible. First of all, congratulations for finishing that enormous project. That's yeah, that's incredible.
Although, the amount of work I did pales compared to what Ryan has done.
Yeah.
But yes, thank you. Congratulations are to Ryan, who altered 100 cards for this deck.
Wow.
But yeah, thank you. It's what just turned into a thing that I'm like, yeah, I'm just going to get it done. I'll do the whole deck. Of course, I didn't think through the fact that any changes I make, I'm going to have to get alters done from Ryan as well. But,
Right. Even more painful than it would have been.
Exactly. That's what it is.
I love that. Yeah, we've shouted out the Commander Cookout podcast before, but I would love to throw a link to Ryan's. I think is it on Facebook where the auctions are held?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I've definitely.
I think every Thursday night he posts them, I believe.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to include a link to that in the episode description below. Yeah, because it's really cool. It's incredible how much content, how many alters Ryan is able to create, and they're all really incredible.
He does fantastic work.
Yes, 100% agreed. And I had not realized. You'll have to send me a picture of your deck of your actual deck sometime. I almost said deck list, but the actual thing sometime, because that's really cool. Yeah, in a way, every card is a pet card when it's
exactly
when it's unique like that.
Once you've done that, they're all kind of pet cards.
I love that. So the next question I've got for you is, what would you consider is your MVP card in the deck, or the card that you want to see at every game because it makes everything else work?
Tezzeret, Master of the Bridge is definitely one of them. It's a card that just kind of puts me in a position where I can just empty my whole hand onto the field and then maybe kill somebody as well. I don't know if I guess he has abilities beyond that +2, but I don't really pay attention because all I really care about is the ability to +2 him. That's definitely one. There's a couple of big beater golems in here, Mycosynth Golem and Metalwork Colossus, that both Metalwork Colossus costs less to cast based on the total converted mana cost of non-creature artifacts you control. And that always feels fun to drop a 10/10 for 0 mana or something, because I have enough things in play that reduce the cost of it down to nothing. So I love being able to top deck and I guess I'm going to play this Metalwork Colossus for nothing. So that's going to be free. There's a 10/10 in play for free. So that's one that always feels really good. And then there's a Mycosynth Golem here that has affinity for artifacts, and it gives artifact creature spells affinity. So kind of the same thing. I get to drop that pretty often for nothing, and then just empty my hand out and play a bunch of creatures for absolutely nothing then. So just it feels very kind of God mode then at that point.
Yeah, Metalwork Colossus. I've tried to play it here and there since it came out, but I find myself with a lot of artifact tokens, not necessarily converted mana cost cards. But it seems incredible in this deck where, you already have, at least half of the deck is artifacts with a mana value.
Then my commander, giving it basically unblockable because of how Intimidate works, it doesn't have Trample by default. So, generally speaking, in most decks, it's just going to get chump blocked. You're not going to very often poke through that 10 damage. It's pretty easy to do in this deck. I can drop it, and people think, okay, well, I'm okay for the chump block. I can take care of that and whatever other big things I have in play. Then I drop Vela, and they're like, oh, I guess I'm just taking 30.
Man.
Yeah.
I'm a fan. I just if it's big unblockable creatures, it just never gets old. I love it.
Yep. I for sure. I'm with you.
While we're on the topic, I'm obliged to shout out the Mirror Battlesphere that's in this deck.
Yep.
A couple episodes ago I did a Mirror appreciation episode where my friend Livi and I just talked all about Mirror and Mirror combos and strategies, and I think this deck is a fantastic spot for a Mirror Battlesphere. I mean, our thing at the end of that episode was that people should just play this card in more decks because it's amazing. But in this deck especially, I love it. That's great.
It does all the things I want. It gives me a big beater to poke damage through. It gives me a bunch of bodies to go wide. It gives me things to sacrifice to Vela. It's all of the things on one card.
Mirror Battlesphere just continuing to be one of the best commander cards, and I will stick to that rant for the rest of this episode. So
totally agreed.
Okay, so the next question I've got for you is, what has been your favorite in-game moment that you've had while you've been playing this deck?
So the one that jumps to mind was last fall. Some real life friends of mine, we all got together because the COVID pandemic, people didn't really get to travel, and by last fall everyone was vaccinated and things were lightening up enough that a couple friends were able to get together in Vegas. So like none of us lived close by, but we all met in Vegas and got an Airbnb for 3 or 4 days. And
nice.
we basically played Magic. It was the nerdiest get together probably in Vegas you're going to get. We didn't really do much Vegas stuff other than, I guess we walked the strip one day, did a few things like that. But like for the most part, we just played Magic like a bunch of nerds.
Love it.
And I was playing this deck one night, and someone I looking at my board, and I knew there was something there. I'm trying to figure it out as then I passed a turn, and the next player, I think it was a Crater Hoof or something along those lines, they dropped to swing in. Like, okay, I'm attacking for lethal. And I'm like, okay, give me a second here, because I could tell based on my pieces, I knew I had an answer. It took me like 2 minutes to put it all together. And what it wound up being was I did have a hangerback walker that I had played with half a dozen counters or something on it. And I was able, so once I saw everything, I was able to sacrifice the hangerback walker which then did a Vela damage because Vela was out. Yeah. And that put 6 or 7 tokens or something into play. And I had an Arcbound Crusher out. Whenever an artifact comes into play, you put a +1 counter on Arcbound Crusher. And it also has modular. And I was able to sacrifice an Arcbound Crusher, and or then I brought back the Walker again at instant speed somehow. I think with a Scarecrow, but I can't remember what it was. Sacrificed the Crusher to get a Vela trigger, move all those counters back onto the hangerback Walker, sacrifice it again, and at this point then I have 15 or 20 Thopter tokens in play. I was able to then sacrifice Vela to whatever Ultra I had out to get Vela triggers to the person, and then use all of that mana that I had available that I made off the altar to put into something. I don't remember what else it was, but I was able to at instant speed somehow deal 26 damage or something to the person that was attacking for lethal with a Crater Hoof.
Wow.
And it just took me, I'm like, it was one of those the gif you see of the person doing computations and trying to do all the big math. That's what I was doing in real life. I'm like, it's here, the pieces are here, but I just need a minute to figure out what goes where. And I was able to then figure out where X minus 23 equals whatever.
Yeah.
So I managed to solve the equation in mid attack step.
That's incredible. So memorable. I feel like that's kind of how artifact decks go sometimes. You're like I didn't intend for these to combo in this way at all, but they're on the board and here we go. Now I have a billion Thopters and Vela's
exactly
my damage output, and let's just put it together.
And this definitely of my decks is the one that probably has I've had those most of those moments where just everything kind of worked out and came together like that, for sure.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that kind of lends itself to what we were talking about earlier about having lots of various paths to victory and lots of different options throughout the game, which, the more choices we make in a game, it probably the more we'll be able to kind of put things together and make it work. So yeah, that's a fantastic example of that. Thank you for sharing.
Yep.
I love it. Okay, we have gotten to our final question, which is, what advice would you give to players out there who maybe we've piqued their interest with this deck and they want to try to go and build a version of it themselves? Do you have any advice for people looking to do that?
I would definitely say don't be intimidated by the handful of expensive cards that are in the deck. You do not need them at all. I mentioned there's a Mox Opal in here. I had a Mox Opal from something. I can't remember what it was, but I had gotten one from I think it was in Double Masters pack or something. I wasn't actively seeking out a Mox Opal for this deck. I happened to crack one and I have an artifact deck. I have a mana rock that cares about artifacts, I guess I'll put it in the deck. But the deck functioned just fine without that Mox Opal. You absolutely can build this deck without that expensive card. There's an Underground Sea in here. You don't need that. I had an Underground Sea, so it's in the deck. But you 100% do not need an Underground Sea in this deck at all. Matter of fact, it probably causes me more harm than good, because if I'm playing against a stranger and they see an Underground Sea, they probably assume the deck is way more, combo-tastic or way faster than it is. This is not a super speedy deck. I'm not winning, very often before turn 10. It's just not that kind of deck. But when you see an Underground Sea, you kind of assume it's going to be something pretty powerful. Not only do you not need one, it probably actively hurts me sometimes, because it really changes the perception of the deck. So I would almost say basically you could build the majority of this deck without spending more than $3 or $4 in any one card. The majority of the cards that really matter, that make the deck work, are relatively cheap. So despite the fact that if you bring up the price tag for this particular list on something, it's going to look way more intimidating than the deck actually is. Any of the expensive cards just don't need to be here. You could absolutely build a very affordable version of this deck and have it function at 98% of what this version runs at. Nice.
I think that's really good advice. It reminds me of Joey's upping the average videos. Every time he's here are 6 cards. You absolutely do not need to spend $50 on each of these. So there's half the price of the deck. Just put whatever you think will be nice in the deck instead.
Joey and I kind of brew very similarly. That was one of the things that really that we've hit off when we first started doing the podcast, that we had in common, was we both tend to like to brew decks, and we either use bad cards to make the deck stronger than it probably should be, while also running strong cards that are weaker than they should be in the deck. Because we both have, we've both been playing a long time, and we happen to have lucked into a few of these older cards over the years, but we tend to run them in decks where they just absolutely do not belong. But that's kind of something that we have in common, and we do routinely talk about, hey, I've got this really strong card. I might as well run it in this deck where it's not going to be that good, but it'll be kind of funny.
Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of a thing that you put these cards in, and you enjoy them, and they're kind of, I don't know, unique to you, so they just kind of stay in there. And so I think that's a cool way to give advice about this deck, is especially with artifacts. There's so many different artifacts and different kind of sub synergies you can put together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I like that. I think at the beginning of your answer to that question, you said don't be intimidated, but that might be kind of hard considering who the commander is.
Yeah, no pun intended, but I guess I made the pun anyway.
The dad jokes are slipping into
exactly.
Other podcasts.
I can't resist. Doesn't matter where I'm at, I can't resist.
Oh, man. Well, thank you so much. I think that's the rest of my questions that I had for you for this deck interview. Is there anything else that you want to kind of wrap things up with, or any shout outs you want to make, or anything else as we kind of wrap things up?
I'm going to shout out both my podcast co-hosts on both shows, Chris and Max on CMDR Central, and Matt and Joey on the EDHRECast. Those guys do a lot of work every week to make me sound good. I'm very fortunate that I've been able to work with really good people over the years that have helped me out. So my co-hosts there have definitely done a lot of heavy lifting and helped me get where I'm at. I'll mention one person I'm going to shout out quick too, Jason Alt, who is the content manager at EDHREC, and he's been at Brainstorm Brewery forever as well. Jason he seems like a kind of a prickly guy in general, and maybe I think that's the persona he's intentionally trying to put out there for himself. He's also a sweetheart, and he gave me a chance to write for EDHREC when I really wasn't very well known. And he was one of the guys behind the scenes that set up the EDHRECast as well, and gave me a shot there. Jason's just I want to shout him out because he's part of the reason I've been successful here as well. He's given me chances, as has Don Miner, who runs EDHREC. People like that have been very helpful to me in my career as well. So, everyone likes to think that they've got where they're at because of their own skill or hard work, but right. I got a lot of breaks and got a lot of help from a lot of other people along the way that's helped me achieve some level of success doing this. So I think it's worth noting the people that did help me out along the way.
Totally. Yeah, I think just the Magic community in general is so many people like that are super friendly, super helpful, just positive and do great things.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I'm happy to also include links to everyone we just talked about, their social medias. Go follow on Twitter, go consume some of that content. I'll have links to all of that below because it's great. It's some of my favorite Magic content, and I wouldn't be doing this probably if it weren't for EDHREC stuff and getting me interested in the data side of things. And the whole reason I'm doing this is so I can talk to other people like you. So having other people out there to talk to is really important. And I appreciate and totally 100% agree with everyone that you just shouted out. That's fantastic.
And thanks to you for making great content and sharing this hour with me. I appreciate it.
Anytime. I'm happy to do it. I was really excited when you responded and agreed to be on the show. So thank you one more time, Dana, for joining me and letting me talk to you for an hour. And so we'll include links to all of Dana's content as well down in the episode description below. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me on Discord, Instagram, or Twitter. Also a link down below. And these episodes are also going to be released not just on podcast platforms, but also on YouTube. So if you want to, go check us out on YouTube. And I think that's it. So thank you for joining us for this episode, everyone, and welcome to the Faerie Conclave, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.